What's up, everyone? Welcome to Weekends with Anna Kasparian and Nando Vila. Kyle is our super producer. He's on the ones and
Kyle?
twos. I said Kyle. Oh my God. Kale, my bad. I'm not on my A game today.
How
I had
long
a
have we
rushed
been doing this
morning.
show?
No.
Kale, come
That
on.
was my
Come
bad.
on here. Come
No,
on.
don't.
Come on here. We need to address this. What happened? What happened there? Kyle?
I don't know
I
why.
don't know. I really don't get. Anna, how long have we been doing this?
I'm sorry. I misspoke. I was actually, look, to be honest with you, as we were coming in, I was reading a text message from Ben Burgess, who is apparently staying with you, Kale.
Yeah, he's like 20 feet away from me right now.
So I don't know. People are saying that they love the Burgess. People are saying so. Maybe later for the super chat section, he can join us. I don't know. I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying.
How do you get from that to Kyle?
I was reading his text message to me and Nando stating that he's staying with you as like we went live, and then I got flustered and said Kyle. Like it just came out as Kyle. So that's that's what happened.
One would call this one would call this a slip. We'll do a full set. We'll do an analysis in the Q&A later.
We should do a 20-minute decode on it for sure. Yeah. But anyway, everyone, thank you for joining us. We will be answering your super chat questions later in the show. We're also going to have a fantastic episode today where Nando, I don't know what your decode segment's going to be on. What are you talking about today?
I'm talking about the Havana syndrome.
Nice. Havana syndrome making another appearance on the show today because we've talked about it before, but in the context of like a SALT segment where we pretty much made fun of it. I think a deeper dive is definitely necessary. I'll be talking about the corporate Democrats in the banter segment of the show. We'll talk about how 3 corporate Democrats in the House voted in their committees to defeat the provision in the reconciliation bill that would allow for Medicare to negotiate drug prices directly with pharmaceutical companies. It's infuriating, and I'll give you the details in just a moment. And then later in the program, I'll also talk about how the media fails time and time again to really dive into the conflicts of interest and the financial motives that politicians have when they reject hugely popular legislation like the reconciliation bill. So I'll be focusing on Joe Manchin, but make no mistake, it applies to many corporate Democrats. We're going to have a wonderful interview today. We're going to have Megan Day join us and Seth Ackerman to discuss the 10-year anniversary of Occupy Wall Street. So I'm really looking forward to it. It's going to be a great show.
Very
All right.
excited.
Yeah. So why don't we get started with the what the corporate Democrats did in the House this week? It was really a story that was ignored for the most part, but I think that it gives you a sense of just how the sausage is made and how, there is this very aggressive fight to strip the reconciliation bill of incredibly important provisions. So 3 corporate Democrats in the House Energy and Commerce Committee are fighting to strip the budget reconciliation bill of a popular provision that would allow for Medicare to negotiate drug prices directly with pharmaceutical companies. I'm sure our incredibly intelligent audience already knows that it's banned. Medicare cannot directly negotiate drug prices, which blows my mind every time it's back in the news. But that is the case. And it's something that pharmaceutical companies and their lobbyists have fought really, really hard to not only make happen, but to preserve. And that's what's happening right now with these 3 corporate Democrats. So Representatives Kathleen Rice, Scott Peters, and Kurt Schrader reportedly claimed that including Medicare drug price negotiations in the package, get this, would keep the legislation from ultimately passing, despite polls showing the provision actually has widespread support. And I'll show you some receipts in regard to that in just a moment. Now, this is my favorite part of the story because of how absurd it is. So Representative Rice said this: I do not support advancing policies that are not fiscally responsible and jeopardize the bill's final passage. So according to Representative Rice, and of course she's lying, allowing for Medicare to negotiate for lower drug prices which would save money for the Medicare system, is not fiscally responsible, Nando.
Mm-mm. Mm-mm. No, no, very irresponsible to, spend less on prescription drugs than more. That's up is down, black is white. I'm sure we will see a barrage of criticism from the liberal media about a supposed lack of unity and disloyalty from these three representatives for tanking not only a very popular provision, like you said, something like 90% of voters support it, but the centerpiece of both Joe Biden's agenda, but also the entire Democratic caucus in the House, which ran on this over and over again in 2018, if I recall correctly. So yeah, I'm sure we'll see. I'm sure we'll see those takes.
Yeah, it's amazing how little attention this got in the press, right? Now, let me be clear. Right now, committees are negotiating the bill, the language of the bill, the various provisions that are included in the bill. And while it was voted down as a result of these three corporate Democrats in the House Energy and Commerce Committee, the House Ways and Means Committee voted in favor of the provision. The point here is that there's going to be a showdown in regard to the most relevant and critical provisions in this bill. Now, you have progressive lawmakers in the House who continue to issue incredibly strong statements about how they will block the corporate desired bipartisan infrastructure bill unless they ensure they get these provisions passed, unless they ensure that they get 3.5 trillion passed in the reconciliation bill. But look, the only irresponsible behavior is really coming from these corporate Democrats who are actually crushing their own constituents with these ridiculous stunts on behalf of their corporate donors. So Americans currently pay 2 to 3 times more than people in
Mm,
other wealthy countries for prescription drugs. 1 in 4 struggle to afford prescriptions, and 30% of Americans report having cut pills in half or skipping doses to save money. But,
Jesus.
Democratic lawmaker Kathleen Rice would have you believe that negotiating for lower drug prices is somehow fiscally irresponsible, just
Thirty
insulting our
percent
intelligence.
30% of Americans are cutting pills in half.
Yeah.
Like the medicine that they need. 1 in 3 Americans are doing that. Like it's just it's again. I mean, it's the cynicism that this kind of thing breeds, right? After, I mean, it's the double bind of American politics, right? In that it's like you're stuck between these two parties, who neither of whom give a shit about you, and you're browbeaten to vote for these Democrats all the time, and then when they take power, there's always something. There's always like, and it's always like a one or two thing, like it's always like, oh, the parliamentarian, oh, the it's in the committee of the thing, like it's these kind of like incredibly arcane things within the institution that at the soonest kind of at the smallest roadblock, they just throw their hands up and be like, well, it's in the committee of the energy and the thing, and we can't do that. We can't do it. And the parliamentarian said the thing, and we can't do it. And it's like we get like the voters get all riled up, and they get so emotionally invested in these election outcomes, and there's so much money spent, and so much energy spent, and so much media coverage about them. And then they go and they do the thing, they pull the lever for the Democrats, and then they go and they do this, and it's again, there's no excuse, there's no excuses for it. This is They control the House. They control it. It's not like the big bad Republicans are doing anything to block this. So it's one of those things that just breeds an incredible amount of cynicism in the population. It just beats people
Totally.
down because they want to. This is like the most popular policy. It is as big of a no brainer as you could ever imagine in American policy in American politics, and they're
In
not doing it.
fact, yeah, in fact, why don't we go to just how many Americans want this particular provision included? Let's look at Kathleen Rice's district and how her constituents feel. Turns out that 90% of Rice's constituents support the provision, while only 18% believe the argument long made by pharmaceutical companies that allowing negotiation by Medicare will harm innovation. Similar poll results were found both in Peters's and Schrader's districts. In fact, the New York Times, not the New York Times, my bad, the Data for Progress group put together this handy map that shows you, gives you a little visual of just how popular this particular provision is. So the darker the shade of blue, the more support that part of the country has for the provision. And as you can see, at least 88% of voters in even the more conservative parts of the country want this provision included. And then you get to places like, I mean, look at how dark blue Florida is. Look at how dark blue Maine is. Look at how dark blue, parts of Texas happens to be. And it's because this is really a nonpartisan issue.
Yeah.
Americans in general overwhelmingly support this provision because everyone's getting completely screwed by the high cost of pharmaceutical drugs. And so, finally, what is driving or influencing these lawmakers to essentially go against the desires of their own constituents? Well, Peters and Schrader have both accepted tens of thousands of dollars in donations from the pharmaceutical industry this election cycle. Pharmaceutical companies are the top contributors to Peters's campaign in the 2021 and 2022 cycle, donating more than $88,000 so far. And look, these lawmakers, corporate Democrats, corporate Republicans, they have no problem hoeing themselves for cheap. And that's, $88,000. You might wonder, wow, is that all it takes to essentially vote against something, to continue pain and suffering that literally impacts their own constituents? And the answer is yes. They're bottom of the barrel people. They don't
Yeah.
care. Yeah.
The pollster, like the data scientist, or I don't know what his title is, David Shore, the data analyst, I guess, who's very influential within the Democratic Party circles, and is not exactly like I wouldn't describe him as like an idealistic guy. He said that of the policies that they've polled, they've polled like something like 184 potential policies, because like his whole theory is like Democrats should run on the most popular policies that they could possibly run on. And he polled like 100 and some 80 some policies. And this policy was consistently the most popular one, which is probably why the Democrats ran almost exclusively on this. Like if you looked at ads in the 2018 midterms, this was like the issue that they kept on harping on back over and over and over again, because their internal polling showed them that it was like literally the most popular policy that they could possibly implement. Like no divisiveness, no potential kind of like right wing backlash from voters. Wasn't like touching guns or defund the police or opening the floodgates to all the immigrants or something like that. This is like the kind of thing that is about as safe a win as you could possibly get in American politics, and they're not going to do it.
No, they're not going to do it. And, they bank on exactly what has happened after voting this down in their committee. They bank on the corporate media avoiding the story, right?
Yeah.
So, you got to go to independent sources. You got to go to places like The Intercept to really figure out what's happening during these negotiations. In terms of corporate media, you'll get, pieces published by Axios arguing that, oh, well, Senator Sinema has this accountant-like focus on
Oh
the
my God.
national debt. And it's like,
Oh my God.
F off, dude. Like we know
That
we
was
know
the
what's
most
really going on.
embarrassing. That was the most embarrassing piece. That was one of the most embarrassing pieces I've ever seen in my entire life. Like these journalists, like who are these people? They're like little children. Little children, they just gotta dangle a little thing in front of them. They're like, oh my goo goo gaga, like a little mobile, like a little infant playing
That's
with like a little
amazing.
mobile above their crib. They're like, oh my God, look how amazing this is. She's got the spreadsheets. She's got spreadsheets. And it's like,
Imagine,
how can you people believe
yeah.
this shit?
No, imagine considering yourself a journalist and literally just taking everything politicians tell you at face value and just regurgitating it, either on air or in the case of Axios, just like publishing it. It's like, oh, accountant-like focus on her spreadsheets. I got news for you. The only spreadsheets that she might be focusing on include the donors that have contributed to her campaigns and exactly how much money they've given. She's not
She's
pouring
got
over the
like
national debt.
she's got like she's got like in Clueless, she got like a share in Clueless. She's got like her outfits in a spreadsheet, and she does like these kind of random algorithms to like match her skirt with her blouse, and that's how she chooses her dope outfits to vote down a $15 minimum wage. That's how she does it. She puts the spreadsheets in, and that's what they tell her to wear.
That's right. Yep. I mean, it's so pathetic. And look, if Democrats genuinely do care about unity, something that they, I mean, Biden was really the most vociferous about the need for unity. I really do think that there are some Republican voters that Democrats could court if they materially improve their lives. So there actually is unity in the electorate when it comes to policies that would improve their lives. It's just that, a lot of the division that we see in the country is based on what our politicians and what our media is hyper focused on. And it's the culture war BS to deflect from the bread and butter issues that the vast majority of Americans do happen to agree on. So that's where we are. All right. Well, before we get to our decodes, why don't we give a shout out to our partner over at Verso?
Yes, if you join the Verso Book Club, you get every new ebook in the mail, including one or more. Sorry, I had to pull it up. Yeah, sorry. I had the Verso book read. I sort of got I had it, and then I accidentally exited out because my computer was eating too much memory. Okay, so if you join the Verso book club, you get every new ebook that Verso publishes each month, as well as one or more books in the mail. All Verso book club members will also get 50% off everything on the website, including the Verso Comrade tote bag, for as long as you are a subscriber. All memberships are 50% off for your first 3 months. The Comrade tier is only $20 a month, and if you join in September, you'll get these 4 books: Everything, All the Time, Everywhere: How We Became Postmodern by Stuart Jeffries, Everything and Less. It's kind of funny. The Novel in the Age of Amazon by Mark McGurl, Revolution, an Intellectual History by Enzo Traverso, and Work Without the Worker: Labor in the Age of Platform Capitalism by Phil Jones.
All right. Love it. Well, let's get right to our decodes. And it's a little bit of a continuation about, what we've already discussed in our opening segment. And it's, what motivates these corporate Democrats to go against the best interests of their own constituents. And they are aided and abetted by the corporate press. So let's get to it. President Joe Biden met one-on-one with conservative Senator Joe Manchin in an effort to persuade the senator to support the $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill, the very bill that, unfortunately, Senator Manchin has been vociferously against because of a host of ridiculous, hollow talking points, including that it's too expensive or that we need more bipartisanship. Now, unfortunately, even though Manchin had already publicly rejected the bill, Biden thought maybe I can threaten Manchin with the bill that he actually does want passed, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which includes privatizing infrastructure, something that Manchin's donors want, and it also includes corporate handouts. Now, Axios has just reported that Biden bombs with Manchin, meaning that this one-on-one talk unfortunately was not persuasive enough. The article goes on to claim that Axios was told Biden explained to Manchin his opposition could imperil the $1.2 trillion bipartisan infrastructure bill that's already passed in the Senate. Biden's analysis, though, did little to persuade Manchin to raise his top line. So, what is his top line? I mean, that was something that has been in question, and it appears that Manchin is unwilling to spend anything above $1 to $1.5 trillion, meaning that the $3.5 trillion the $3.5 trillion reconciliation package is just far too expensive. We can't spend that kind of money. It's unacceptable. That's what we keep hearing from Manchin, and it's frustrating because he's full of it, and I'll explain why in a second. But let me also just give you a side note in regard to the Axios piece in question here, because it doesn't help that the article was written by Hans Nichols, who just the other day published a laughable article arguing that Senator Kyrsten Sinema's rejection of that same bill had to do with the fact that, she's just really responsible about the deficit and the debt. He wrote that while Senator Joe Manchin is getting attention for balking at a $3.5 trillion top line price tag, he wrote this, accountant-like focus on the bottom line will be equally important to winning the votes of them and other key Democrats. Now, Biden also had a one-on-one meeting with Sinema. It's unclear whether he was more successful in persuading Sinema But it is a little concerning that Manchin seemed a little unfazed about the progressive lawmakers threatening to block the bipartisan infrastructure bill. It seemed like that was the area where progressives have some leverage. And to be clear, they should still use that leverage and call Manchin's bluff, because I guarantee you his donors absolutely do want the passage of that bipartisan bill. Now, in reality, if anyone's paying close attention, it's clear that Manchin is captured by corporate donors, of course, and this is important, his personal investments, which means he has serious conflicts of interest that typically go unreported in the mainstream press. Lawmakers like Manchin spew hollow talking points about the need for bipartisanship or how he's worried about the deficit as they announce their objections to legislation that would materially improve the lives of their own constituents. The media just accepts their talking points at face value. That's obviously not journalism, and it's certainly not helpful to the American people who deserve to know what really motivates these lawmakers. It took an accurate tweet from Representative Alexandria Ocasio Cortez to get CNN's Dana Bash to finally ask Manchin the right questions. Earlier this week, Ocasio Cortez responded to the West Virginia senator stating that he won't support the $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill because he's allegedly concerned about the price tag, or because he's captured by the corporate interests, not because he's actually worried about the price tag. Let's watch.
I'm sure you've heard your fellow Democrat, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, said this about you in a tweet. Manchin has weekly huddles with Exxon and is one of many senators who gives lobbyists their pen to write so-called bipartisan fossil fuels bills. It's killing people. Sick of this bipartisan corruption that masquerades as clear-eyed moderation. This is your fellow Democrat.
Well,
is it true that you have weekly meetings with Exxon
not.
and other
absolutely
lobbyists
not.
for fossil fuel?
Ever, no, they don't. Weekly meetings, I don't.
It's just false.
I keep my door open for everybody. It's totally false. And those type of superlatives, it's just awful. Continue to divide, divide, divide. I don't know the young lady that well. I really don't. I've met her one time, I think, between sets here, but that's it. So we have not had any conversations. She's just speculating and saying things because she wants to.
She's not the only one. I'm sure you've heard. There are a number of your fellow Democrats who say that you're opposed to this because you're bought and paid for by corporate donors.
Because it makes no sense at all.
Got to be honest, I love watching Joe Manchin squirm. And before we disprove him, before we call out his lies, it's important to look into why he rejects the budget reconciliation bill in the first place, what he has cited as problematic. He is not in any way in favor of the climate action provisions that certainly don't go far enough in responding to the climate emergency, but do happen to be the most robust way the United States has proposed to mitigate climate change. Now, there are also provisions that would help American families. Provisions that include, for instance, free 2-year community college, an expansion of Medicare to include dental, vision, things that should already be included as part of healthcare, to be quite honest with you. It would also lower the age of Medicare. It would allow for Medicare to negotiate for drug prices directly with pharmaceutical companies, essentially lowering drug prices and saving money, not just for the federal government, but for the American people. It also includes childcare. It includes all sorts of provisions that would make Americans whole, or at least as close to whole as possible in this hyper-capitalist system. Let's keep it real. And so Manchin knows that it's wildly popular with his own constituents, but he keeps claiming over and over again that his problem is, well, I'm worried about jobs. I mean, the climate action could lead to job losses in West Virginia. He claims he's worried about the national debt. But the bill would also offer the provisions to help struggling American families, which goons over at Fox News seem to think wouldn't even appeal to Americans. Now, look, just to give you a sense of how popular these provisions are, Stuart Varney over at Fox Business did a segment to talk about what the provisions included. And he got a lot of backlash because it turns out that his own audience members think that these provisions sound really, really good. Let's watch.
If Bernie Sanders gets his way, America will look, feel and perform just like Europe. He and his fellow leftists want to spend $5 trillion to put the federal government in charge of your life, literally from cradle to grave. In Bernie's world, let me outline your life. Before and after birth, parents get paid family leave. Up to age 3, the government helps with daycare. After age 3, youngsters get free pre-K. Parents get cash for their kids all the way through age 18, cash for kids. After high school, 2 years of free community college. And you, the parents, get expanded Medicare with dental, vision and hearing paid for.
Now, to be fair, Stuart Varney actually did a better job explaining the provisions in the bill than I've seen in other cable news shows, which is fascinating because, again, Varney was under the assumption that his audience would hate the reconciliation bill. But upward of 70% of American voters, and that includes Republicans, support the provisions in the budget reconciliation bill. So it's understandable why Varney would get backlash from his own audience members. Now, going back to Manchin and his response to Representative Ocasio-Cortez and how he claims that he does not meet with executives or lobbyists from Exxon, it's really hard to buy that argument when earlier this year, a senior Exxon lobbyist by the name of Keith McCoy was tricked by activists posing as job recruiters during this secretly recorded meeting. He thought, of course, he was being interviewed for a potential job, but he ended up admitting on camera that he does, in fact, meet with Manchin in his office or at his office every week. Let's watch.
Senators pressed to do Exxon's bidding behind closed doors.
You want to be able to go to the chief. Yeah. And so the chief knows you, that you can go to the chief and say, look, we've got this issue. We need Congressman so-and-so to be able to introduce this bill. We need him to make a floor statement. We need him to send a letter. Yeah. You name it. We've asked for everything.
So who are the fish?
I'm Joe Manchin. I approve this act because
the biggest catch, according to Mr. Coy, it's the conservative Democrat Senator Joe Manchin, who famously shot President Obama's cap-and-trade climate bill.
And I'll take dead aim at the cap-and-trade bill.
Joe Manchin, I talk to his office every week. He is the kingmaker, and he's not shy about sort of staking his claim early and completely changing the debate.
Oh, he's the kingmaker. Meets with Joe Manchin's office every week, but apparently Joe Manchin is clueless about that. I don't know. Is he like sedated when that meeting happens? And, there's also quite a bit of reporting from sources like Open Secrets that indicate that Manchin has taken quite a bit of funding from ExxonMobil, which, of course, has no interest in passing the budget reconciliation bill, knowing that the climate provisions would hurt their bottom line. So analysis of campaign disclosures found the 6 Democratic senators, Mark Kelly, Maggie Hassan, Joe Manchin, Chris Coons, Kirsten Sinema, and John Tester received a combined total of nearly $333,000 from lobbyists, political action committees, and lobbying firms affiliated with Exxon over the past decade. And look, despite the overwhelming evidence that Manchin is beholden to his corporate donors, that he's basically captured by them, in interview after interview, if he's ever asked about it, he pretends like he's completely clueless. I bring you this exchange between Cenk Uygur and Joe Manchin back in 2017. I thought it was a great interview, but get a load of how Manchin responded to the accusations of legalized bribery.
Well, you voted to repeal the stream protection rule. And your top donor is First Energy that wound up getting in some degree of trouble for putting arsenic in a pond. It seems like they would benefit from the repeal of that regulation. So did that have anything to do with your vote?
No. Jenks, I know it's hard to believe, and I know it's hard for people to, I don't have any idea who gives me money. I don't solicit from the standpoint, you do this for me, quid pro quo. That's never been me. That's not my political mantra at all.
This is the list of your top donors. I thought you said that you don't, I understand that you said you don't do quid pro quo. That was clear.
Yeah.
But you know who your top donors are, right?
I do not.
You don't know who your top donors are?
I do not. You're showing me something I've never seen.
Okay, so this is from Open Secrets.
I know you have, Jenks. I know that is hard for anyone to believe. I do not.
Yeah, notice there are quite a few energy companies listed as his top donors. And one of the reasons why it's so hard to believe that Manchin has no idea about his corporate donors is due to reporting by The Intercept earlier this year, when reporters like Ryan Grimm and Lee Fong obtained audio of Manchin's meeting with the billionaire donors behind the group known as No Labels. At the time, members of his own party were fighting to end the Senate filibuster, which requires 60 senators to vote in favor of legislation in order for anything to pass. Now, that's the reason why legislation typically goes to the Senate to die. But Manchin kept fighting over and over again to maintain the filibuster. And his main argument was we need to maintain it because bipartisanship is important. We need to reach across the aisle. We need to show that we can unite the country. Now, with the stimulus bill or the coronavirus relief bill that was passed during the Biden administration, that really showed that the GOP had no interest in working together. They had no interest in bipartisanship. In fact, Manchin said we need to maintain the filibuster and just negotiate with the GOP. He did a bunch of concessions on behalf of the GOP, including additional means testing for the relief. He also was able to cut down the unemployment insurance from $400 a week to $300 a week in the middle of a pandemic. And the whole idea was we don't have to get rid of the filibuster. We can pass this in a bipartisan way. Everything's going to be great, except they weren't able to pass it in a bipartisan way. Not a single GOP lawmaker voted in favor of it. Now, when he was meeting with those billionaire donors from No Labels, he realized my talking point on bipartisanship is not going so well, so I need your help. Manchin told the assembled donors that he needed help flipping a handful of Republicans from no to yes on the January 6th commission in order to strip the far left of their best argument against the filibuster. The senator even suggested enticing his right-wing colleague, Roy Blunt, who's retiring, with a job offer after he leaves public office, telling the big money donors, quote, Roy is retiring. If some of you all who might be working with Roy in his next life could tell him, that'd be nice and it would help our country. That would be very good to get him to change his vote. And we're going to have another vote on this thing, meaning the January 6th commission. That'll give me one more shot at it. So understand that he wasn't trying to entice Republican lawmakers to vote in favor of economic policy that would improve people's lives. He was specifically trying to get these billionaire donors to offer Roy Blunt a job as soon as he's out of public office in return for a yes vote on the January 6th commission, just to give the American people the illusion of bipartisanship in the Senate. Now, the reconciliation bill would raise taxes on the wealthy and corporations, which is a major reason why his corporate donors are against it. But the media tends to leave out that fact from their coverage. And they also tend to leave out the fact that Manchin himself is a business owner. He is a millionaire in his own right. And he's worried about his own profit motives. Manchin himself is a millionaire who would end up paying more in taxes if the reconciliation bill would pass with tax increases on those making $400,000 or more per year. Also, while Manchin claims to be concerned about jobs in the fossil fuel industry, it's more likely he's really just looking to maximize his personal returns on his investments. So I take you to Robert Reich, who writes that Joe Manchin founded 2 coal companies in the 1980s, which are now led by his son. His family's fortune relies on allowing the fossil fuel industry to keep wreaking havoc on our planet. Also, this is super relevant, Manchin's most recent financial disclosure shows that he has made nearly $500,000 a year, or last year, due to his personal investment in the coal industry. According to his most recent financial disclosure, Manchin gained $492,000 last year due to his non-public shares in a coal company called Enersystems, which records show is a contractor for a power plant in the state's north that burns waste coal. Meanwhile, Manchin's 2020 income for being a senator was $174,000. That's relevant because it shows that his investments in coal more bring him money that's more than double his salary for being a senator. So then there are other conflicts of interest that are worth mentioning. For instance, Manchin objected to increasing the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour, arguing that $11 an hour is just far more reasonable. What was left out of the corporate media coverage of that debate was the fact that Manchin is a stakeholder in a company that owns a hotel in West Virginia, which would be forced to pay its workers a higher wage, thus cutting into their profits. As TYT Investigates reported back in March, AA Property is reportedly 50% controlled by Manchin and is an investor in Emerald Coast Realty, which owns a La Quinta hotel in Elkview, West Virginia. The national average salary for several La Quinta positions is well below $15 an hour. If Manchin's $11 an hour proposal were to win out, which it didn't, there was no increase in the federal minimum wage. La Quinta hotel housekeepers, for instance, would get an average wage of 8 cents an hour nationwide. But it would have far more of an impact on the workers in West Virginia, where they're paid far less. Now, again, paying those workers would cut into the return on Manchin's investment. That is a huge issue. How do we allow lawmakers to have these personal business investments when they're supposed to be passing policies based on the best interests of their constituents, not based on the best interests of their pocketbooks? Instead of emphasizing this clear conflict of interest or even mentioning it at all, the media continued to bolster Manchin's claim that Democrats need to tone down their demands in order to appeal to GOP lawmakers. But not a single Republican lawmaker in the Senate or the House, as I mentioned earlier, voted in favor of the COVID relief bill. All they've been interested in is stripping down proposed legislation coming from the Biden administration. And by the way, the media also ignored Manchin assuring the powerful lobbying group known as the National Restaurant Association that he was committed to blocking the wage increase.
We've been having meetings on minimum wage, and I can't for the life of me don't understand why they don't take a win on $11. But Bernie Sanders is totally committed, and his heart and soul that 15 is the way to go. Well, it might be the way to go, Bernie, but it ain't going to go. You don't have the votes for it. It's not going to happen. So they're going to walk away with their pride, saying we fought for 15 and got nothing. And I said, we could start down the path, $11, take care of tip wage, because that's very important in your industry that we're talking about, to make sure that it won't get that out of kilter and mess up the whole industry. So I can tell you there's more than just me as a Democrat that believes that the path they're going down is wrong. But if it comes down to one person, I don't believe it should be above 11. I don't think tip wage should ever go above half of that.
From your lips to God's ears.
Yeah, that was pretty disgusting. And honestly, that's just another one of his hollow talking points, that raising the federal minimum wage would actually hurt workers because businesses would have no choice but to shut down or to cut jobs. But let's really take a look at how much Joe Manchin is concerned about job losses, even in his own state of West Virginia. It's especially rich considering Manchin's unwillingness to step in as more than 1,400 workers, unionized workers in West Virginia, lost their jobs over the closure of the Viatris pharmaceutical plant in Morgantown. The jobs were offshored to India and Australia, which sounds like a really great idea, just as we're experiencing how fragile our supply chains are in the middle of a pandemic. Now, as Democracy Now! Reported back in July of this year, Viatris was formed through a merger between two pharmaceutical companies, Mylan and Upjohn. Mylan's chief executive, Manchin's daughter, Heather Bresch, got a $31 million payout as a result of the corporate consolidation before the new company set about cutting costs, including the closure of the Morgantown plant. The fact that Manchin's daughter received a massive golden parachute over the merger likely played a role in the senator's unwillingness to do a damn thing to prevent the loss of thousands of unionized jobs in his own state. So, the president of the United Steelworkers of America, Local 8975, and a worker at the plant says that Beatrice has given little reason for the closure except to say that the company is looking to maximize the best interests of the shareholders. Because, of course, understandably, it was unsurprising when the union representing the workers at the time reached out to Joe Manchin, reached out to his office, and all they got was the cold shoulder. The union president stated that Joe Manchin gave the union members 2 minutes of his time several months ago and has not done anything meaningful on their behalf. In fact, Manchin's apathy toward these workers was pretty brazen.
The majority of penicillin and such is made outside of the domestic United States of America. But Joe Manchin's first question to us was, and I was on the call with 4 other officers at the Union Hall at the same time, are you all still making penicillin at the facility? We haven't made penicillin in Morgantown, West Virginia for more than 20 years.
So, all of this context, all of these conflicts of interest, it goes beyond legalized bribery and corruption. It has to do with the personal material interests of our lawmakers. Those are the things that fuel their decisions, the way they govern, the way they legislate, and what type of legislation they're willing to even propose as they allegedly represent the very people who elected them into office in the first place. The fact that our lawmakers are able to be invested in individual stocks is already a massive conflict of interest that never gets addressed. And during the pandemic, it became very clear that members of Congress are trading off of insider information that they received during undisclosed briefings about things like the pandemic, for instance. So we are supposed to live in a democracy where we vote for lawmakers who campaign on things that we care about, things that would improve our lives. But one of the main reasons why they don't actually carry out our interests is because of their own material interests that get completely ignored in the press. They need to be banned from being able to invest in in individual stocks. They should not be able to have a little side hustle or side business that would clearly serve as a conflict of interest. And I just want to remind you all that during the Trump administration, rightfully, there was a lot of coverage about his conflicts of interest, about his violations of the emoluments clause of our Constitution, because he's a businessman, and that could really be harmful if we have a president who's looking out for his own business as opposed to the best interests of the American people. But when it comes to congressional lawmakers who engage in similar behavior, all we get from corporate media is stenography. Essentially claims that they're worried about bipartisanship, they're worried about uniting the country, they're worried about the debt or the deficit. Are they really issues that they're concerned about? And why is it that we have journalists that are just regurgitating what lawmakers are saying to them, instead of questioning what their real interests are? So, democracy is undermined both by the legalized bribery, but more importantly, by the fact that you have lawmakers looking out for their bottom line. And it's something that needs to be acknowledged and something that needs to be legislated against. Nando.
I often think of the media as their main role to obfuscate real power and how power is exercised in this country. This is especially true of the liberal media, which elevates everything to, like you said, like these kind of lofty concerns over bipartisanship or whatever, fiscal responsibility or whatever. Like as if anyone actually believes in any of that stuff. And the thing is, like, they may believe it on some level, like, but it is because of a foundation of power relations. As Mark said, it's the base and the superstructure. not to get all, not to get all Cale Brooks on you, but it's and what the media does is ignore the base, like, or purposefully obfuscate the base, and only talk about the sort of high level ideas or whatever. I mean, this is why
Right.
a lot of people on the left enjoy reading the Financial Times, because the Financial Times is often, in the context of the mainstream press, doesn't engage in that. They do engage in actual kind of power relations. They just are on the other team. But it is clarifying to read it, because you can see how power actually works. Whereas, yeah, it's so frustrating to see it, because, again, it doesn't matter. And the thing is, it doesn't matter what's inside someone's heart, like, it really doesn't.
Exactly. Yep.
And you can go crazy trying to figure it out. It is a fun kind of like debate to be had on a Friday night when you're amongst your friends and you've had a few drinks, and you're just like, so these Democrats, do you think that they're just like stupid, or do you think they're liars, or do you think they're, and it's like, there's a combination of both.
No.
And and you'll never
I
really
think they're
know.
rational actors. I think they're
Yeah.
rational actors. And I think that they do what's best for them as long as the system allows for it. And the system allows for it, right?
Yeah.
Like, they might be called public servants, but they're not really interested in serving the public. And it's not about them being good guys or bad guys. It's about material interests, right?
Yeah.
Like, the media's tendency to treat congressional lawmakers as if, like, they're above all of that. Like, that they're not in any way greedy or looking out for their own, financial interests is ridiculous. They're rational actors at the end of the day. And you're right. Like, the power structure is what needs to be focused on, and what the real incentives are. And I just think
Yeah.
that gets completely ignored. Yeah. In the mainstream conversation.
And just the level of corruption is just it's so disgusting. It's so disgusting. Like, the American state is just like so corrupt.
Totally. Yeah.
It's again, it's like corruption happens almost everywhere, and there's limits to like anti-corruption politics and all that stuff, but the American state is just so utterly corrupt. It's crazy. Like, if you just stop and look at it for 5 seconds, you're like, this is so disgusting. I mean, and the thing is, like, it's funny because Americans have this view of history that is kind of like, if it happened in the past, like, if it happened more than like 15 years ago, it's in the past, like, it's way in the past. So, like, everyone kind of understands very well that cities like New York City in the turn of the century, with the Tammany Hall machine, and and that Chicago local politics was like dominated by the mafia, and like, they understand like that in history, but like, they don't see the current thing as kind of a version of that, or like maybe a slightly more polite
Yeah.
version of that. But it's really the same thing.
Well, I mean, the Supreme Court carried out exactly what corporate interests wanted it to carry out. I think the reason why the corruption is seen differently now is because it's given this, like, facade of, I guess, the credibility of, like, legality, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's like, oh, but it's, Supreme Court said this is okay. This is just political speech. It's totally fine. Totally
And
okay.
the other thing that drives me crazy is that it becomes just like another part of like the horse race analysis of politics that places like Politico do. It's like, who's winning the money race? Like,
So
like in
annoying.
any
Yeah.
election, it's like, it's just another data point to judge who wins the horse race, not as like some. It's not like, wait, this is disgusting. Like, the fact that this is like, it just becomes like another, just like, oh, like, this person's up a few $1 million, and the other one has a lot to catching
Yeah.
up to do. They might have to, and that whole thing is just disgusting as well.
It's like them announcing, I don't know, like, some athlete's stats as if it's a good thing, right? Like,
Yeah.
the person who raises the most money is the person who's winning. So, there's that extra layer of doing positive PR for the
Yeah.
legalized bribery that happens in this country. So you're absolutely
Yeah.
right about that.
Yeah.
Well, let's move it over to some foreign policy on a topic that I don't know. I mean, I've been amused by it. I think
Yeah.
it's ridiculous, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say about this, mysterious Havana syndrome.
Well, it's another bit of kind of, I guess, in a way, media criticism too, because if you've been following the news in the last few years, you may have seen this strange little story pop up every once in a while. And yes, I'm talking about the case of the so-called Havana syndrome, in which American diplomats in Cuba and other places complained that they were being attacked by mysterious brain-melting microwaves.
New details on a series of bizarre attacks. Dozens of unexplained illnesses, including head injuries, forced the U.S. to bring home diplomatic staff from China and the U.S. Embassy in Cuba. Speculation at the time was that it was some sort of sonic attack. But now the scientist who led the investigation tells the New York Times the main culprit is likely some kind of microwave weapon.
It's a microwave weapon. Now, this story broke conspicuously shortly after the Obama administration ended decades of hostility towards Cuba and began a process of normalizing relations. The alleged Cuban attacks on U.S. diplomats were used as a key reason for the Trump administration to reverse that policy. The U.S. government has now been investigating the Havana syndrome for years, and the media has breathlessly reported it every step of the way, often using words like James Bond spy thriller to describe it. Now, this was in both the New Yorker story and in the 60 Minutes piece about it. They described it as a James Bond-like story. Now, I'm not a journalism professor like Anna Kasparian is, but if I were, one of my lessons would be if the story seems like it's something out of a James Bond movie, it's probably bullshit. But I digress. This week, the Biden administration quietly admitted that it is no longer calling the phenomenon the Havana syndrome. This is from a Newsweek report. Havana syndrome is the term widely used in the United States to describe symptoms reportedly suffered by staff at Washington's embassies in Cuba and other countries across the globe. But the Biden administration has quietly renamed the malady to cut the reference to the capital city in which it was first observed. We refer to these incidents as unexplained health incidents, or UHIs, a State Department spokesperson told Newsweek. Isn't that conspicuous? Well, of course, this barely got a notice in the U.S. media, but one person who did notice it was Dr. Jose Ramon Cabañas Rodriguez, who was the former Cuban ambassador to the United States. He tweeted out, "Some interesting developments. Havana syndrome becomes UHI as U.S. backs down on blaming Cuba." Now, this whole business of the mysterious radio wave attacks on U.S. diplomats is almost too perfect a case study in how awful the media is when it comes to matters of national security. Every step of the way, the mainstream press has credulously presented the most inflammatory explanations for the phenomenon while ignoring any dissenting opinions or facts that may muddle the narrative. For example, last year, the National Academy of Sciences published its report commissioned by the State Department on what happened.
Last weekend, the National Academies of Sciences released the first authoritative government report concluding the victims were most likely hit by directed pulsed radio frequency energy. The lead author was Stanford microbiology and immunology professor David Relman.
That form of microwave radiation is really not terribly common in the world around us. It's sometimes used, for example, in radar systems. It sometimes is used in clinical medicine for treatment of certain ailments, but it's not common in the home around us or in the world that we normally frequent. And that's what makes it a little bit unusual, and the sort of the message behind it a little bit different.
The message: someone may have pointed a non-lethal weapon at U.S. government employees in order to harm them. And some former intelligence officials tell me that the perpetrator was likely Russia.
Now, this led to a wave of coverage. That guy was all over the place.
Stanford professor of medicine David Relman chaired the study.
We have neurologists on our committee that said afterwards, in my entire career of reading about countless hundreds and thousands of cases of neurologic injury, I've never heard of something like this.
This is really unique in the medical literature.
It is.
Politicians even started passing laws based on this and, quote, looking to hold someone accountable.
New Hampshire Senator Jeanne Shaheen has been fighting to get the victims medical assistance and answers about who did this.
If we don't hold those responsible accountable, then we can be sure it's going to continue to happen. And that's a national security risk to the United States and to our personnel.
Now, the next step of this usually is the intelligence agencies started leaking their own classified internal reports, this time about Big Bad Russia.
According to U.S. intelligence documents obtained by CNN, Russia has been developing this microwave attack capability for decades. Today, Bill Burns, President Biden's nominee to lead the CIA, telling Congress,
I will have no higher priority than taking care of people, of colleagues and their families. I will make it an extraordinarily high priority to get to the bottom of who's responsible for the attacks.
No higher priority at the CIA. What didn't get nearly as much coverage were the scientists who read the report and were highly skeptical of its findings. This is from BuzzFeed News. They write, however, experts in both microwaves and group psychology were highly critical of the report's conclusions. Quote, the report does not make a coherent argument why microwaves should be involved, said University of Pennsylvania bioengineer Kenneth Foster, who first described the mechanism behind the Frey effect in 1974. The effect requires very high power levels to produce barely audible sounds, he said, and it's not known to cause injuries. Maybe someone went to the trouble to truck in a large microwave transmitter to cause the employees to hear clicks, but there are simpler ways to harass people than that, he said. Another one said, quote, this is not science, but science fiction, said UCLA neurologist Robert Ballo, co-author of Havana Syndrome, Mass Psychogenic Illness, and the Real Story Behind the Embassy Mystery and Hysteria. News reports alone, not considered by the panel, paint a picture of illnesses spreading through the patients in ways that look a lot like past group psychology outbreaks, Ballo said. There's a lot of misunderstanding these symptoms are real. People are really injured, even among physicians, he added. Now, this exact pattern is the same thing that we saw 3 years ago when the University of Pennsylvania published the first report on the Havana Syndrome in the Journal of the American Medical Association, or JAMA. That report was the key basis for all of the media coverage on these supposed attacks. Again, dissenting voices were largely ignored, voices like that of Robert Bartholomew. This is from The Guardian. Robert Bartholomew, an expert in mass psychogenic illness, who teaches at Botany Downs Secondary College in Auckland, said he was, quote, floored by the study and claims that it reads like U.S. government propaganda. In the article, the doctors state that their objective is to describe neurological manifestations that followed exposure to an unknown energy source. But Bartholomew points out that there is no proof that any kind of energy source affected the diplomats or even that an attack took place. It's like the authors are trying to get us to believe an attack has occurred, he told The Guardian. Now, Natalie Shore, who often writes about health policy for Jacobin and other places, pointed out just how flawed that original JAMA study was. She tweeted, the JAMA studies on the so-called Havana Syndrome are perhaps the strongest piece of evidence wielded to make the case for both brain damage and attacks, but there were unusually significant problems with each, which are ignored in the new round of reporting. For one thing, symptoms included things like headaches, dizziness, and brain fog, all very common abnormalities reported in JAMA, used arbitrarily low threshold for abnormal, could have been caused by stress, anxiety, depression, etc., and didn't compare against appropriate control group. Concerningly, researchers dismissed psychogenic causes of illness with arguments that misunderstand what that even means. It doesn't mean patients are faking it. Their symptoms are and suffering are real. It's their attribution to mysterious hostile attacks that's in doubt. Okay, so now at this point, Natalie Shore began wondering, how did this paper even get past peer review? And the answer is, it almost didn't. UCLA neurologist Bob Ballo peer-reviewed it and recommended rejection. And she points experts in Bob Ballow's books in the case in which he recommended that they don't publish that report. Instead, JAMA moved forward with publication, motivated perhaps by a splashy politicized scoop, but hedged their bets by running it alongside a highly skeptical editorial that's been largely ignored. Now, that highly skeptical editorial that ran alongside the JAMA report was largely ignored by the media and everyone else, really, a fact that was pointed out by Mitchell Valdez Sosa, the director of the Cuban Center for Neurosciences. He wrote, this is from The Guardian, an editorial, this is quoting him, an editorial published alongside of the JAMA study, which also urges caution and calls for more evidence to be rigorously evaluated before people reach definitive conclusions. But Valdez Sosa points out that while the study is referenced on the U.S. State Department's website, which calls on people to reconsider travel to Cuba in light of health attacks, the editorial, which raises a long list of caveats, is not. This has been politicized, Valdez Sosa said. I think people are using this to push for the rolling back of the relationships that had started to blossom during Obama's presidency. In fact, after the study was published, a group of 15 scientists published a joint letter criticizing the findings. Again, as neuroscientists and physicians, and this is from their letter, as neuroscientists and physicists, we have no reason to dispute that U.S. diplomats living in Cuba heard loud noises or that they reported feeling ill afterwards. Some U.S. politicians have seized on these reports to construct conspiracy theories in which they imagine a mysterious disease-causing sound ray gun, something that isn't possible with today's technology. These same politicians have used their positions of authority to present their speculations to a credulous public as though they are fact. The pronouncements, in turn, have led to international confrontation and hysteria, resulting in the removal and expulsion of diplomats and travel advisories. A preliminary communication from the University of Pennsylvania with U.S. government support, published in the prestigious Journal of the American Medical Association, or JAMA, has been used to buttress this putative acoustic attack idea with science. In fact, that work is deeply flawed and does nothing to support the attack theory. Even the FBI looked into the matter and found no evidence of attack. This is from an AP report. Following months of investigation and 4 FBI trips to Havana, an interim report from the Bureau's Operational Technology Division says the probe has uncovered no evidence that sound waves could have damaged the Americans' health, the AP has learned. The FBI report, which hasn't been released publicly, is the clearest sign to date of the U.S. ruling out the sonic weapon theory. The report says the FBI tested the hypothesis that air pressure waves via audible sound, infrasound, or ultrasound could be used to clandestinely hurt Americans in Cuba and found no evidence. Again, this inconvenient bit of the narrative was inconvenient bit of information was largely left out of the narrative. Obama's thawing of relations with Cuba was one of his few genuinely good accomplishments. Sadly, it was rapidly undone by President Trump, and there's little indication that President Biden has any interest in re-implementing the policy that his former boss had towards Cuba. This business with the Havana syndrome makes it almost impossible for Cuban diplomats to deal with American diplomats in a serious and productive way. I mean, what are they supposed to think when the Americans are accusing them of doing Dr. Evil-esque crimes? The idea that Cubans or Russians or whomever would have secret weapons technology that the U.S. doesn't know about, or indeed technology that the U.S. itself doesn't already possess, is utterly laughable. It's the kind of thing that falls apart when you think about it for just a few seconds. Yet that assumption has dominated U.S. diplomatic circles for years, aided and abetted by a credulous media. We must, as ever, remain skeptical of any story like this, stories that foment suspicions about America's official enemies, be they Russia, Iran, Venezuela, Syria, North Korea, or Cuba. The reporting standards at news organizations drop dramatically when the accusation is leveled at one of those countries. Think about that whenever they try to tell you about fake news.
Yep. I mean, what more is there to add to it? I mean, as the timing is also so specific, right? Right after Obama approaches Cuba with diplomatic intentions, then we start hearing about the microwaves. We start hearing about this attack. And the inability to really explain specifically what it was, right? Like this invisible weapon that's like targeted toward US diplomats. Like it just seemed fishy from the get-go, which is why I feel like it kept reemerging in the news, like almost like testing Americans, like, are they ready for this now? Like, can we scare them with this now? And it's like, it's not working. It'll fade into the background, then it'll come up again. But it is just amazing how these manufactured threats regarding our, foes come up over and over again. Like, I think the more ridiculous example during the tail end of the Trump administration was, that Russia was paying the Taliban bounties for U.S. soldiers. And it was like, what is your evidence for that? And they relied on one unnamed source and later had to retract that story. So you're right. You got to be super skeptical because, look, especially right now where you need global cooperation to combat the real national security threat, according to the Pentagon, by the way, which is climate change. Like, how are you going to work with Russia or China or, whoever the boogeyman is in any given administration, unless you are willing to put whatever interests or differences aside and focus on the real threat that we're already, by the way, suffering the consequences of. So yeah, but some people got mad at me because when we talked about the Havana syndrome on TYT, like, I don't know, maybe a month or two ago, we were just kind of making fun of it because like the symptoms just sounded like jet lag. You know what I mean?
Stress.
Stress, jet lag. I'm like, I don't know. I could feel that way on
The
any
stress
given
of
week.
like being the tip of the spear of the American empire and doing awful shit around the world. Like that,
Right.
that would stress me out.
Oh my
You know,
God.
like,
Yeah.
I mean, if we had more time and if I had more time to prepare, which I admit I did not have as much time as I would have liked to, I would have included a lot of stuff. But the main kind of public whistleblower, for lack of a better term, or the main public voice is this guy who's a CIA agent based in Russia, and he's like all over the media doing interviews about like his suffering at the hands of these dastardly Russians who are, you know, microwaving his brain. And it's just like the gall of all the reporting around it. It's like, well, he was in there doing intelligence operations in Russia, and like
Yeah,
he was
I
like,
know.
they have no right to, you know, like to. He's a CIA agent. Like they say, like they did have, like it just seems utterly appropriate for you know, a state to protect itself against you know, foreign intelligence agents who are there doing all kinds of like, you know, destabilizing shit in their own country. Like that aspect of it was really funny. But like, you know, Natalie took a lot of this research very seriously when she looked into it, and it seems pretty clear that the symptoms are that there is something going on, that it's not just all they're all not just making it up, that there's enough kind of medical evidence that there is some sort of thing. But what seems pretty clear is that it's one of these kind of social diseases in which like you're in an environment, and it's a bit like mass hysteria, that like you're in an environment, you're in a sort of social world, and people start to feel sick, and that spreads not by some sort of virus, but it's like a sort of psychological effect that happens, a little bit like a version of like what a placebo, if like, you know, that a placebo can make
Totally.
you feel better, and it's like all in your head. It doesn't mean that they're lying about themselves, like they're feeling bad, but it's just, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's like this that there's like this Bond villain in there with like this super technology that the US doesn't have, that the US doesn't possess.
Right.
Which
Right.
is just utter, like the fact that they think that the Cubans have something that like the
Oh,
Cubans,
it's so good. I
the
know.
fucking
I know.
Cubans.
I know. I mean, it is pretty incredible because on one hand, you know, there's you know, look at how awful Cuba is. They've got nothing. They're, you know, they can't
They're
do right by
poor.
their own people. They're poor. And then on the other hand, they're
Yeah.
like, they have this like super sophisticated biological weaponry that like it's invisible. And it's like, okay,
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
But
And like
anyway.
highly targeted,
Yeah.
like the degree of, you know, like that they're not like just zapping an entire hotel or something, like that they can get to like a specific person within the thing. Like it's just so insane. It's so insane. But the media coverage is really breathtaking. Like you could do an entire book just on the media coverage of this one story. I mean, there's like too many examples to put into the piece, because it's crazy.
Yeah. I remember one of the first episodes of the show that we did together, we talked about Havana syndrome, and you brought up, I wish I could remember the name of the writer, and I think it was in The Atlantic, remember? Like the coverage of it was just so laughable. And
Yeah.
again, like no real.
Oh no, it was Julia Yaffe in
That's
GQ.
right. That's right. Yes, I remember that.
That
was like one of
story
our first
is
episodes together.
spectacular.
It really is.
That is spectacular.
Well, we encourage you guys to go back into the archives and check out our conversation on that very article from months and months ago. But it was a good time. Lots of poking fun at it, which I enjoyed. Now, why don't we move on to our interview? Because joining us today, we have Jacobin staff writer Megan Day, and also Seth Ackerman, who is the executive editor over at Jacobin. Is Seth with us as well? There we go.
Yeah, we got both of them.
Nice. Hey,
We're
Seth.
doing like a Bill Maher panel style type show.
How many squares can you fit on that screen?
I don't know. That's a good question.
All right. Well, let's get started because today marks the 10th anniversary of Occupy Wall Street. So we figured it would be interesting to have a discussion about where the left was 10 years ago and what's changed. In this date, have there been any advancements when it comes to some of the causes that Occupy Wall Street protesters were calling for? What were some of the flaws with Occupy Wall Street? What are some of the improvements that the left has made since? And so I'll go ahead and start with you, Seth, because Kale actually sent us this lengthy panel that you hosted at the time regarding Occupy Wall Street. And, I'm curious what your view of Occupy Wall Street was then and how things have changed.
Well, it was kind of a double event in the sense that Occupy was obviously in itself this gigantic event that really dominated the political landscape, certainly on the left, but also beyond the left for a while. But then at the same time, at a personal level, we were just getting Jacobin off the ground at that point. And Jacobin was and is, a political project that had so many concerns that overlapped with Occupy, so many issues that we were particularly interested in that in one way or another were brought up by the Occupy movement, either sometimes in positive ways, sometimes in negative ways. And, one of the things that we had intended to do in starting the magazine, one of the things that at the very beginning we were really interested in doing was sort of intervening in the culture of the left that existed at the time and trying to reintroduce the left to some older styles and mentalities of left-wing politics that had gotten forgotten in this culture, this left-wing culture that had emerged in the U.S. over the previous few decades, and that you could see on display very vividly at Occupy, which was a sort of horizontalist, anarchist, anti-state, very suspicious of institutions and certainly of the state. Institutions, whether that's political parties or trade unions or whatever. So these are the kinds of issues that we were really interested in intervening about, or in intra-left debates. And then right at that time when we were started to publish Jacobin, it was a sort of like a gigantic exhibit of all of the contradictions of the left at that point, including so many of the ones that we thought were really important to talk about and argue about. So, it's in many ways, you look at Occupy and you see a kind of a crossroads, because on the one hand, it is entirely, to paraphrase somebody else, it's stamped with the history of the left as it existed at that time. But it's also was an event where the left was sort of struggling to change itself and discovering new ways of conceiving what political action is. So you had this event that it had been started by, it had been instigated by a small group of anarchists, including David Graeber. He supposedly was the one who came up with the slogan, "We are the 99%." And these people were about as purist and as ideologically committed horizontalists as you could find. And the political culture of their way of doing politics really dominated the atmosphere at Occupy. And yet, at the same time, you could see that there was something already that was different, if only because of the nature of the content of Occupy. So, the style and the approach to politics was all the way that the American left had been for so many decades. But the content really reflected the ways that the left was being forced to change. So it was a movement that was focused. First of all, the slogan "We are the 99%," even though it was David Graeber who came up with it. I think that his ideas were a little bit different from some of his comrades, but it's such a majoritarian sentiment. Obviously, "We are the 99%," which it was controversial. A lot of people didn't like the idea that we, our collective subject that we were creating at Occupy, would identify in that way. But it was incredibly effective. I mean, "We are the 99%," I think, had an enormous, can take enormous credit for whatever success Occupy had in sort of capturing the imaginations of people who were not immediately there. And so that
Can I?
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, I wanted you to elaborate a little more on some of the objections to "We Are the 99%." What was the rationale behind that?
Well, there were a few things, but I think that the main objection was motivated from a position that said that was basically that wanted to view the antagonisms in American society as being more about sort of different parts of the working class, some of which had been co-opted into supporting capitalism and the status quo, and others who were struggling to free themselves from the yoke of that, of that status quo. And so they were very much, there's a vision of the left from people who tend to be, on the anarchist left, or at least that was the case at the time, whose vision is a lot less, vertical of political antagonisms and a lot more horizontal, and feel that it is papering over the contradictions within, the broad working class to talk about the 99%, which means that you're really saying that almost all of us are on the same side and just a tiny elite is on the other side. People objected to that a lot. And, if you look at the kinds of issues that were brought out in Black Lives Matter, then you can see that there's, the kind of logic that there is there, but as far as the strategic wisdom of framing a protest movement as we being the 99% and they being a small elite, which made a lot of sense and it resonated at the time because, of course, this was after the 2008 crisis and there was a lot of attention focused on the financial system and Wall Street, and the protests, of course, began in downtown New York around near Wall Street. So that it all resonated and it made a certain kind of sense, and strategically, and this is where I think that was, was ingenious on David Graeber's part to have come up with it. Whatever the truth may be of the complexity of the antagonisms in American society, which obviously don't run just between 1% and 99%. Slogans are not there to be like PhD dissertations and capture like all the nuances and fine truths of the situation. What that captured, though, was an element of was a feeling that was increasing. People were increasingly having that had not been something that people on the left were necessarily would gravitate towards. It was this feeling that that really our society was being sort of run by a group of unrepresented people who didn't care what we thought. We had gone through the Iraq War when 1 million people were on the streets demanding that there not be a war, and they were just ignored. And then the outrages of the financial crisis and the housing crisis and the bailouts and all the rest of it, really so many people who were not political looked for the first time at what was going on, and that kind of a critique that says, our society is being run by a small number of people who really don't care what we think, despite the claim that we live in a democracy. It made a lot of sense. So the slogan made a lot of sense. And so all of those currents were, I think, pushing the left at that moment to reevaluate some of its like received wisdom that had accumulated over the previous decades.
Megan, what was your experience with Occupy? How did you live through that time?
Well, I was in my final year in college, and so I participated in the Occupy movement that was on my campus, but I think I had a slightly different flavor. So I went to a liberal arts college that you might know from many scandals, Oberlin College. So we had an Occupy Oberlin, and as you might expect, it was like Seth has said that Occupy in New York wasn't necessarily riven with the identity politics that would come to characterize the next sort of phase of life on the left. It was at Oberlin, and that might just be because some of that stuff originated at Oberlin. So that was my memory of Occupy on Oberlin's campus. Or originated in these elite academic spaces, right? So I did make my way to New York. I think that I think it was for Thanksgiving break, so it was just some hangers on essentially in Zuccotti Park. I was not there as necessarily a political participant. I was, I believe, rolling on MDMA. I had a great time. It wasn't very political.
Nice.
So, but that said, actually the experience, I'm making it sound like quite negative, but actually in the years that followed, I returned often to this question of the 99% versus 1% framing. And it was very clarifying for me in helping me find my way to the socialist left. Because at the time I was in communities where there was an analysis of oppression that seemed to be increasingly complicated, and it almost seemed like oppression radiated from every person to every other person. You might be able to do some calculus on the basis of whether or not people checked certain identity boxes, but it was very hard to pin down and almost panoptic, and therefore very difficult to do anything about. It wasn't a very encouraging worldview when it comes to actually affecting change. I remember a few years later having conversations with people where I said, Occupy is now faded into the background, right? And I remember, at this point, the style of identity politics that we see very commonly on the left today had just started to kind of leak out of the academy and Tumblr and the NGOs, and was becoming a little more mainstream. And I remember saying 99% versus 1% makes a lot more sense than most of what I'm hearing. And so my fondness for Occupy grew over the following years as I compared it to the trends that I saw taking place on the left. And I think that Occupy in that sense actually primed me for, it certainly primed me for Bernie. When Bernie was announced that he was running in 2015, I felt like I'd had a few years to think about 99% versus 1%. I'd come to the conclusion that was probably the framing we should use. So I feel more sanguine about it now, actually, than I did at the time. But I wasn't, like Seth, I wasn't actually involved with the intricacies of the Occupy movement because I was, on an, isolated elite campus in Ohio. So, well, that said, I mean, we should talk about what the sort of pros and cons of that framing are. And, over time, I think I think the socialist movement has developed beyond the 99% versus 1% framing in a way that's actually very helpful and good. But I do think that framing, that binary framing, is kind of a left populist framing that captures anti-elite sentiment and encourages people to think about a direct relationship between exploiters and exploited, or oppressor and oppressed, a more binary and conflictual, antagonistic relationship, which is actually a good basis for priming people ideologically for Marxism. That doesn't mean that everybody who participated in Occupy eventually became a Marxist, certainly not. But I do think that, the rise of sort of Marxist-inflected millennial socialism in the United States in the wake of Bernie actually owes a lot to the popularization of that rhetoric during Occupy as well. So that's my positive spin on the legacy of Occupy. There are also some, negative things. Like, for example, I think that we haven't yet rid ourselves on the left of some of the worst habits that you saw dominating the actual sort of occupations. And one of those would be a kind of, I guess anarcho-liberalism is the term that's often used. Like Bhaskar said something about, Bhaskar Sunkara actually wrote an article in September of 2011 about anarcho-liberalism. And I'll read a little excerpt of it from you. He said, the Marxist-derived left was defeated while social democracy reconciled to the neoliberal framework. These are things that happened in the 20th century. Anarcho-liberalism, in quotes, sauntered in a weird middle ground between both camps. Its representatives had the modest ambitions of the social liberals of the center left, but the flair for the dramatic associated with the most militant anarchists of the far left. So that's his sort of diagnosis. I'm not even sure that we can really say for certain that Occupy had modest social democratic aims, because I'm not sure that it was ever quite clear what Occupy's aims were, but probably if you polled people, that would be true. A lot of those people essentially wanted what became, the Bernie Sanders platform, but with the dramatic flair associated with anarchist direct action.
Yeah, I got the sense from Occupy Wall Street that there was finally, in a very public way, an acknowledgement of issues with our system, right? And I feel like it was a starting off point where then people kind of like dove into their own like self political discovery, right? And I want you to talk a little more about the anarchy component of it, because and also what Seth mentioned in regard to the lack of trust in institutions, which on one hand is understandable considering institutions have failed people. But then you kind of fast forward to where we are today, where one of the major policies that's being pushed for and championed by socialists is Medicare for all, which would rely heavily on the very institutions that, you know, maybe Occupy Wall Street at the time was incredibly distrusting toward. Seth, can you weigh in on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I think that to some extent we continue to see those same disagreements play out in the years since then. But I feel like there was, if you compare the situation today on those issues, like the one that you just mentioned about, you know, Medicare for all being a solution to a problem that relies on big institutions, obviously the state, the Medicare system, all that kind of stuff. I feel like in the intervening years on those kinds of issues, there has been kind of a pretty clear one side won the argument and the other side reconciled itself to just being in the minority. And so that was progress. I mean, this is why I think that when we talk about all of the things that we don't like about Occupy, those very things that we didn't like about Occupy at the time, actually, by being there, by existing, I think that in the long run, they contributed enormously to pushing the left towards the kinds of things that we do like. And that's because, and this is always the way that I think movements work, is that, you know, movements try to do things that are stupid, and then they have to deal with the consequences. And in grappling with the consequences and arguing and figuring out why this isn't working and why things are going wrong, that's how movements move forward and how they make progress. And at the time that it's happening, it's incredibly frustrating. But in retrospect, I feel like all of the things that were so obnoxious at the time actually ended up playing a really important role, because by being what I consider to be annoying or obnoxious or just wrong-headed, they sort of took the ideas that we a Jacobin, this nascent Jacobin, wanted to critique, and they put those ideas that we wanted to critique sort of to the test, and in front of a massive, an audience of the whole world. And and then there was a test, and we could all see how well or badly they worked. And I feel like in some ways, we ended up, our side of those arguments ended up winning most of those arguments pretty decisively. Gradually, it took time, it's never complete, and so on. But we ended up winning those arguments, and we won them in the fairest way. It was, let's try your way, let's try our way, and see what happens. And the trying of their way was not always really pleasant to deal with, because often it meant we were doing things that some of us thought were misguided. But if we hadn't done them, then there would have been no fair test. And you could see that over the course of the year or two, really just a year after Occupy, so many of the people me and my comrades were arguing with during Occupy, and they were taking very fiercely entrenched positions in favor of a very hardcore version of their type of kind of horizontalist politics on every issue across the board. And then you'd run into them, or you'd see their byline somewhere 6 months, 7 months later, and they had completely flipped. They were now echoing the kinds of arguments that you were making. That happened over and over and over again. So that's, I think for that we have all of the stuff that was annoying to deal with at the time. We have that to thank for that.
I just find it shocking that you guys are ignoring the real legacy of Occupy, in that it gave us Tim Pool. That Tim Pool made his name live streaming Occupy when the mainstream media ignored it in those first few days. So yeah, I was working at a news organization at the time, and that was a big deal. So, typical Jacobin types ignoring Tim Pool. But Megan, I want to ask you, because you talked about the framing of the 1% versus the 99%, and how effective it was as a sort of left populist rhetorical device or slogan, and I agree. I mean, I remember at the time it was very influential at me as well. But I want to ask about the limits to that, especially in with regards to your piece about classism and class, and why like class is the more effective kind of theoretical frame.
Yeah, so the 1% and the 99%, like I said, is like a good, I guess you could say it's a sort of good transitional ideology toward Marxist socialism, but it's not guaranteed to get you there. So the main distinction between the two is this. The 1% and the 99% is measured on the basis of like how much wealth you have. That's what the 1% is. And then everybody below them is the 99%. And there's some sort of cutoff line, and you can sort of like sort people into above and below. What's good about that is that, like I said, it's binaristic. It has a kind of like fundamental antagonism. It suggests that what's good for the 1% is bad for the 99%, and that's a decent framing. The problem is that it's not actually relational. So in Marxist socialist thought, the working class is defined and the capitalist class are defined on the basis of their relationship to each other, not how much of wealth or money one has compared to the other. So that relationship is that a few people own, what we call the means of production, factories, tools, land, the stuff that it takes to make the things that society needs to run, and then everybody else doesn't own either that stuff or the means of their own subsistence. They're not living on farms anymore, and so they have to work. They have to sell their labor to the people who own the means of production, and it's this mutual dependence actually on the worker and the capitalist that actually defines capitalism as a system of production. The reason that's important to understand is because understanding the structure of capitalism that way actually points to a way out. Because capitalists and workers are mutually dependent on one another, that means that the working class can theoretically withhold its labor, and that would tank profits, which is the only thing that capitalists care about, because they have to continually be reinvesting their profits and to stay afloat. And that through that mechanism, you could actually force dramatic social transformation. So that basically the Marxist sort of analysis of how society works gives you an answer for what you ought to do. You should organize the working class into durable institutions that can actually act as workers and exploit the leverage, the automatic leverage that working people have in their relationship with capitalists. 99% versus 1% doesn't give you that, actually. You have to work to get people toward that understanding from 99% versus 1%. And that's why, even though it was a great framing and it was in a lot of ways, and it was majoritarian, like Seth said, which was good and cut against what would eventually be some of the later bad habits of the left, this kind of like endless search for, marginality, a kind of obsession with the fringes, right? So that was good, but it didn't really give you an answer for how you ought to go about organizing. And you could see that when you look back at what actually happened during Occupy. Certainly there were people in the mix who would have been able to articulate this for you, but it wasn't fundamentally about organizing the working class into durable institutions that could strike at the heart of capitalism itself, that could hit capitalism in its Achilles heel, right? And so that's its kind of main drawback. There's an additional problem, and this relates to my piece, which is that when you're not thinking about the relationship between workers and capitalists, you're not thinking sort of materially or structurally, and so you can end up thinking culturally about things, which can just lead you into an endless culture war. You know what I mean? So,
Yes.
and
I can think of a few examples.
Right.
Definitely.
So on the left, I mean, for example, on the left, this is where you get sort of internecine constant conflicts on the left about who's dressing too posh and who's going on vacation and all of this stuff, and whether or not they're actually displaying the proper sort of like personal etiquette or moral rectitude to actually even be considered socialists, right? Whose side are you on, really? That kind of thing. But there's actually an even bigger problem, which is that can be a valve to right-wing populism. And I say bigger in the sense that it has more dramatic consequences, not that it's necessarily common. But the right wing also has its own versions of populism. I'm going to outsource this real quick to an article that Nancy Fraser, or an interview with Nancy Fraser that we just published in Jacobin. And I sent this to Kale. Kale, can you pull that up? I feel like it's relevant to this conversation and I want to show people. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Give me 1 second.
Kale's scrambling. He's scrambling.
Just continue for like 1 minute.
Continue talking.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure. Okay. No problem. Okay. So the problem is essentially that on the left-wing populism has the sort of 99% versus 1% framing, and right-wing populism looks somewhat similar in the sense that it also is about the people who are being preyed upon by some blood-sucking parasites. But what Nancy Fraser says is that right-wing populism is defined by a kind of tripartite identitarianism. That's the way she puts it, which is that there is at the top,
Tell me more.
There are the elites. They are, not necessarily all rich people. It's like vaguely defined. This is the problem when you don't talk about capitalists specifically. It's just the elites at the top. And then at the bottom of society, there are also freeloaders. There are welfare queens. There are immigrants who are sponging off of our, social programs. There are, if you ask JD Vance, there are childless people who aren't even contributing to the future of our society who dare to have a say. Queer people, all kinds of, you can put all kinds of people in that kind of bottom bracket of like freeloaders at the bottom of society. And the right wing, the logical extension of right-wing populism is that there is a conspiracy of elites at the top and blood-sucking freeloaders at the bottom who are engaged in a project of squeezing the people from both ends, and the honest people need to rise up against them. And this is the basis of all essentially fascist ideologies. And I think it's important for us to note that left-wing populism is very distinct from right-wing populism. But when people are not clear about what you're referring to, when you put sort of anti-establishment and anti-elite sentiment out there, you do leave the door open for explanations that are fundamentally anti-socialist in nature and can actually proffer anti-solidaristic explanations that interfere with the project that we're trying to accomplish, which is to organize the working class in solidarity across lines of difference in a majoritarian coalition against the capitalist class. So that's a latent potential, and it's a problem with left-wing populism. I'm not going to say, and watch out, there's red brownism afoot everywhere you look. That's not the implication that I'm making. Just that there's some clarity is necessary. Because 99% versus 1% gets us part of the way there, but it doesn't get us all of the way there. And there's like an odd little wormhole into a different realm potentially embedded in it.
Yeah.
Pointy-headed academics.
Right.
Why do they call them pointy-headed academics? I don't know where that's.
I've always wondered that. Does anyone know why their heads are supposed to be pointy?
No idea.
They're like eggs. So it's a compounds the mystery.
Well, Megan, I think what you're saying is actually really, really important. And what I've noticed is, there's this sense of frustration and powerlessness, on the left sometimes. And when you look at what's worked historically, right, organizing, labor unions, and how that and the applied pressure to the political system to actually change things, how that's worked. When you talk about that, there's like a portion of the left that like rejects it because time is of the essence. We don't have enough time to unionize or to organize. And so they like to rely on more of the performative stuff, right? Which is, not to get into a long discussion about it because I personally would like to avoid it. Like the AOC dress, I personally found a little cringy because it's more of the performative stuff rather than that doesn't really get us anywhere. I mean, it could spark a conversation, but in terms of power and accumulating power and finding ways to organize and use that power to apply pressure and get what we want, like that's something that takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of time, and people, are a little, I don't know, less willing to be accepting of that as being the only way to do things. So, does that in any way help the right wing populace who might, pay lip service to the frustrations that people feel toward the elites, but clearly have very different solutions to the issues that we're facing?
Yeah, I mean, I think any lack of clarity helps right-wing populists, and really any lack of clarity doesn't work in our favor. Actually, Kale, can you throw up that meme? I do not claim to know the provenance of this, but this is, I think, is a nice encapsulation of like, this is a slightly different diagram than the Nancy Fraser definition, the sort of what she called the tripartite identitarianism of right-wing populism. But this is something that I guess some right-wing populist put together. I don't know where it comes from. I saw it on Twitter. But this is okay. Non-rich and rich. This is essentially what you're saying is 1% and 99% here, and they're saying this is the wrong enemy. And then they're saying if you go over here, you can see that the right enemy is that some rich people and non-rich people both are good. They're earners, they're entrepreneurs, and they're protectors. But then you have the bad people who are predators, cronies, and rent seekers who are preying on the sort of like body of the good, upstanding people of society. And these are being counterposed in this meme, but you can see that this meme is actually targeted toward people who already have a sensibility about the fact that there's some sort of elite that is preying on the people that needs to be opposed. And this meme is just educating them out of the 1% versus 99% framing into a very dangerous form of framing that helps only the right. And so my point being that there's nothing sort of inherently wrong with 99% versus 1%. It's just that it's vague. And so our responsibility is to actually do political education around what the real axis of antagonism and conflict in society is between capitalists and workers, so that people are armed with that explanation before they encounter stuff like this, and then develop all kinds of, horrifying ideas about why society is the way it is and who ought to pay for it.
Yeah, that's why we hate Bhaskar, He's the real enemy. But Seth, I want to ask you about a couple things you mentioned. Because one of the things that I appreciate the most about Jacobin's political project is one thing that you mentioned, which apparently was one of the founding ideals from the very beginning, which is that that there are certain lessons to be taken from an older style of politics. Like one of the things I always tell people is like, we don't need we need new solutions for today's problems, or whatever. Like, the new solutions are overrated, man. We need the old solutions to today's problems. So can you expand on that? And as well as, you mentioned that movements typically have to try out kind of bad habits before they're they can eventually kind of move on from them, because we're in a moment right now after Bernie's defeat of probably some bad habits. So like what are the things that can be shed in order to emerge from this stronger, pure, and leaner and meaner?
Well, I mean, I think that the recipes, like you said, I mean, I totally agree that with this idea that we need new solutions that's really kind of the heart of the problem. Most of the solutions we need are old solutions, and that's why in the early days of Jacobin, we sometimes refer to ourselves as the new old left. And the problem with having that recognition of that's the case